as if I'm speaking to a mixed audience. I don't think this is a mixed audience, but I'm going to speak because I'm going to assume, because by assuming that there might be one or two people here who may have different ideas where they support, they've been supporting Israel and they think maybe Israel is more benign than many of us may think. It's important because then you get that perspective. You get the perspective of what I would say if I was speaking to a Jewish audience that was very protective of the state of Israel. So I'm going to speak from that perspective. So I want to recommend, my recommendation though is that wherever you stand on the Israel-Palestine issue, you listen with an open mind. So you can always check my facts later to validate or invalidate what you hear. So let me begin with this. For peace to have a chance, it is critical that greater numbers, especially in the United States, become seriously engaged in this issue. We have to guard against apathy. Apathy is deadly because it gives leaders the permission to disregard the implications of their actions, and it enables them to mislead us about things they've already done and to do things they might not otherwise do if they knew the eyes of the world were focused on their behavior and that they would be held accountable. I'm going to speak about my transformation from reflexive loyalty to the state of Israel to advocacy for human rights for all people by resolving the fear, confusion, and prejudice that is so prevalent. I believe my transformation contains valuable lessons for all of us. I'll also clarify arguments that I made for most of a lifetime, which I thought protected my people, the Jewish people, from injustice, but which, in fact, kept me in bondage to an unexamined belief system and contributed to the suffering of millions. But first I have a suggestion. Although I hope you will deeply consider what I say, please do not believe what I say. If you simply believe what I say, I'm afraid you will not make the effort yourselves to discover the actual documented history of this conflict. And your view will remain either rigidly framed by unexamined belief, indoctrination, or it will change randomly, depending on who you happen to be listening to at any moment in time. You'll be at the mercy of those who may formulate their conclusions not on the basis of objective research, but on the basis of selectively chosen material designed to reinforce pre-existing beliefs. For example, when a reputable historian researches a subject, he does not decide beforehand what his conclusions will be. He allows his conclusions to be dictated by his research. On the other hand, someone whose intention is to promote their own version of history will gravitate towards material that supports their version while avoiding material that challenges it. So we need to do the most objective research possible. Otherwise, we will never discover our roles in the suffering of others, nor will we discover how to alleviate that suffering. And for those of us who happen to be strongly identified with one side or the other, our anxiety will remain unresolved, leaving us with the dilemma of victimization. Why does the world not understand my people, juxtaposed against evidence that is beyond dispute? We also need to get more in touch with our humanity. This requires self-reflection or inquiry into the beliefs and images we take for granted that form a large part of our personal and collective identity. My experience was that inquiry released my heart from a kind of armoring that restricted my ability to feel. And I do not believe we can understand this conflict with the mind alone. True understanding flows from the heart and has far-reaching consequences. Imagine, not just Israel-Palestine, but the future of the world depends on each of us to put an end to man's inhumanity toward his fellow man. If we abdicate this responsibility, there will be no one to blame except ourselves for the tragedies that ensue. Up until the midpoint of the Second Lebanon War in the summer of 2006, I believed that the cause of the Israel-Palestine conflict was the Arab world's non-acceptance of a Jewish state in its midst. And I believe this non-acceptance resulted from centuries of hatred of Jewish religion and culture. I also saw elements within the Christian world as still harboring the anti-Semitic attitudes that produced centuries of pogroms in Eastern Europe and the cruelest event in mankind's recorded history, the extermination of millions of Jews and millions of others because they were judged to be inferior. But then I began a conscientious study of the history of Israel-Palestine. My objective was to separate fact from fiction as best I could. Initially, I read Jewish authors only, knowing that otherwise I would suspect bias. The majority of the research that I did came from authors with access to the Israeli State, Central Zionist, and Israel Defense Forces archives, as well as many other Israeli government sources. I examined differing viewpoints and randomly selected assertions made by the authors and looked at the sources they cited to substantiate their assertions. I wanted to make sure that the author was not taking information out of context or misrepresenting the intended meaning of the source quoted. In some cases, the misrepresentation was shameful. What I learned during the course of this study transformed me. Most people who do objective research will conclude that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is primarily based not on culture or religion, but on land. Two peoples competing for one land. And they would recognize that the cultural and religious disparagement between the two sides was a consequence of that competition. On the surface, I agree that land is the primary issue. But what I discovered goes much deeper. And that is that the root cause of conflict is the attachment to a separate or limited identity and the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce that identity. We rarely, if ever, inquire into these beliefs and images. For example, at one time I believed that a large segment of the world's population held anti-Semitic views. With such a dominating perspective, I was bound to interpret the ideas and behavior of the other as predisposed to incite or ignore the suffering of my people. All of us are receptive to ideas and behavior that fit within the boundaries of our identity. Ideas and behavior that fall outside these boundaries, that originate from the other, are interpreted as possible threats. Fear arises. We look at the world through this filter of fear and unconsciously superimpose enemy images onto the other. We automatically reduce to objects all that we perceive as the other. Then we hide from, disable, or destroy these objects in order to restore apparent safety into our lives. Many Jewish people, influenced by collective memory, equate Arabs with Nazis and other persecutors. A core belief among Jews, including myself at one time, is that Israel, the Jewish home, is a shelter from a violent world. This belief is an underlying aspect of Jewish identity. To maintain this identity, we are compelled, therefore, to justify Israeli policy as a necessary response toward an unremittingly violent people. Dualistic thinking such as this conceives of a world of us against them, good against evil. Our emotions, our attitudes towards others, how we interpret events, what we notice and what we don't notice will mirror our worldview, thereby strengthening and reinforcing it. In short, we create the world we live in. Thus, the real struggle, if we truly want peace, is to transform our consciousness from us against them to tolerance and understanding. It was not until I relinquished my indoctrination and began to learn a more accurate history of Israel-Palestine that I relinquished my enemy images. This relinquishment was so unexpected that I had to test myself to see if these images were really gone. So I imagined myself in the place of Nick Berg, the young Jewish man who was beheaded in Iraq in 2004. Especially being a Jew, Berg's murder had horrified me. But the images would not return. The enemy images would not return. Instead, a feeling of equanimity arose, along with the knowledge that beneath their hatred, even the most bloodthirsty of extremists crave the same right to self-determination as do I. To finally see all people as human beings is a great, great relief. When the relinquishment occurred, I realized that I was as much Palestinian as Israeli, as much Muslim or Christian as Jew. Compassion replaced fear, and clarity replaced confusion. Compassion is the ability to stand in the shoes of the other and see from all perspectives. Therefore, along with compassion, clarity arises. Compassion and clarity, seeking to understand all behavior, ask why the other behaves as he does. What are the stimuli for his behavior? Have we in some way provoked his behavior? Compassion and clarity understand that no behavior occurs in a vacuum, and that each of us is responsible for the suffering in the world, and each of us contributes to the collective mind of mankind. Peace is only possible when we care for people on both sides equally. We don't have to like the other, but we do have to acknowledge that he is just as entitled to self-determination as are we. Without this acknowledgement, peace has no chance, and the people we claim to care about will continue to suffer and die in Israel, in Palestine, and throughout the world. They will suffer and die because our true goal is not their well-being. Our true goal, unconscious though it may be, is to hold on to a presumed and mortal identity. This comes before the fate of even the entire world. I want to look at two of the most common accusations in the debate over Israel-Palestine. The first is the blanket statement that Zionism is racism. Growing up in the aftermath of the Holocaust, I can testify that virtually every Jew of my parents' and grandparents' generation, as well as most of the Jews of my generation, believed that Zionism was a movement whose purpose was to protect our people from further persecution and death. From this perspective, it is inconceivable that a simple need for survival could be interpreted as racism. So it should come as no surprise that many Jews would label those who they perceive as calling them racist as racist themselves. Zionism did not emerge in order to discriminate against a particular race or religion, but was an inevitable, albeit problematic, reaction toward a uniquely virulent strain of racism. To simplistically reduce Zionism to the label of racism minimizes the suffering that gave rise to the movement in the first place. However, Zionism's defenders need to understand that for the most part, criticism of Zionist behavior is not meant to minimize Jewish suffering, but is itself a reaction to policies that Israel has adopted on behalf of the Jewish people. They need to understand that Zionism is the ideological force that justifies the dispossession of an entire society, and that in the hands of Israel's leaders, it has become a terrible form of racism. Israeli policy that favors one population over another affects the lives of millions every day, and the resulting dehumanization is a product of Zionism. The second accusation involves the use of language to delegitimize critics of Israeli policy. Some examples are that these critics are attempting to delegitimize Israel, that they hate Israel, are anti-Semites, or if Jewish, self-hating Jews. The fact is, most of these critics simply want Israel to abide by international law, and nearly every Jewish critic I've met believes that by opposing policies that relegate Palestinians to lives of second-class citizenship, that they are rescuing the integrity of their religious tradition. The majority of these critics are true friends of Israel. A true friend will admonish his friend when he sees him acting irrationally toward his neighbor. These critics have no desire to harm the state of Israel. Their desire is to prevent the state of Israel from harming Palestinians. They advocate equal rights for all because they know that equal rights lead to peace. What exactly is hateful or anti-Semitic in such a position? Is caring about another people synonymous with hatred? Is honoring the humanistic values that I was taught in synagogue a betrayal of my Jewish roots? Is learning about a painful subject symptomatic of anti-Semitism? The bottom line is that for these critics is that if the roles of Israelis and Palestinians were reversed, most of these critics would be fighting for Israeli equality.